my idea with Archeofuturism was that the future is not a time to come.
Yeah.
It's not an epoch in a succession of epochs. The future is a mindset. Being a futurist is to have a certain mentality, the kind of mentality that Zarathustra had 3,000 years ago, where he's talking about sepantominu, the progressive mentality or the spirit of progress at work on a cosmic scale, resisting angraminu, or the force of constriction and constraint and retardation.
And I love what you said about like Prometheus. It's almost like Prometheus in a way it reminds me of Plato in a sense, because Prometheus is speaking into Zeus's ear the same way that you wrote about how Plato went to Syracuse, wasn't it, right? And he tries to get the ear of the leader there, and I'm sure he has to tell these noble lies, and he has to create this exoteric, ideology that someone can follow, but all for the purpose of something greater in the future. And you've talked about it before, like the only time you should ever use an ideology is as a tool, right? You can't become the ideology itself, right?
No philosopher believes in any ideology.
Right. That's what you said. Yeah.
I should be careful saying this, but look, if someone's an ideologue, either he's not a philosopher, or he's a philosopher who's engaging in noble lies and, various machinations, Promethean machinations, to accomplish some hidden aim or goal, right? You cannot be, and which is why, by the way, now that we're on this subject, I really don't know if Dugin can even be called a philosopher. I really don't know that he can be. Because, first of all, most of his writing, and especially, what's published by Arctos from out of his corpus, is political thought. It's mostly political thought, okay? The Eurasianist geopolitical theory, which, by the way, is not all that original. I mean, if you read Hartford Mackinder on the heartland theory versus the periphery, heartland, land power versus sea power, that's already Hartford Mackinder. Dugin started developing his ideas in the 90s at a time when Samuel Huntington was describing the clash of civilizations and came up with that whole theory. So I don't know how much of Dugin's political theory is even really original. And then when you look at his ontology and epistemology, it's Gunonian traditionalism. So where's, as they used to say in the old 80s commercials, where's the beef? They had this little old lady who was criticizing McDonald's and Burger King and shit. Show the hamburger where there's no meat in it. Where's the beef? Where is the substantive ontology and epistemology here? In Dugin, I tend to see an ideologue. Okay? I don't see a deeper philosophical structure which the ideology of Eurasianism is serving in a kind of, pragmatic.
Yeah, it's serving Russia essentially. So that is overtly, physical and political. It's in the propagation of the polity. Right?
Yeah,
so that's absolutely an ideology.
Yeah,
and,
so we're kind of fucked, man. We got, on the one hand, there's a cancer growing out of Nick Land's brain, right? I mean, his philosophy is a tumor that's inhuman. And on the other hand, is Dugin is basically an ideologue. We're in a bad situation here. As bad as Jacques Derrida was, and he was bad. He was bad. I mean, in terms of promoting the degeneration of society and, the disintegration of serious thinking. I mean, Derrida really did a number on us, okay? I don't like the guy. But when you want to compare the complexity and sophistication of Derrida's thought, or even certainly Deleuze, to the people who are supposedly the leading lights of philosophy today, clearly we're in some kind of a civilizational decline. Oh, it doesn't look good on a global scale.
Sure. No, absolutely. But I mean, at some extent, I think what's interesting about techne, again, just to bring it back to that, is you can almost circumvent the political with techne. Because imagine if you had a rogue AI, for instance, right? Then all the powers that exist before sort of become obsolete. I mean, this is a historical phenomenon as well. Look at the agriculturalist societies, right? As soon as iron comes about, it doesn't matter that they have these high walls and are economically superior and have more people, right? Because, the Iron Age invaders come in, and techne it breaks these rules that supposedly exist, I guess. I mean, in your case, with what you're talking about, it even breaks, like quantum rules or whatever, like physical laws. So, I mean, on the one hand, I think, you have to play the political game. You have to get the ears of these people, but on the other hand, maybe there's also completely different means of needing to play the power game. Maybe you just circumvent the power game entirely. Because I've always been critical of, for example, parallel movements, because I've never felt that those work, because it's always this hope that things detract, right? And that, it devolves, and then from there, like, the whole Men Among the Ruins or riding the tiger. To me, there's no point where you're riding the tiger and then you eventually just happen to be above everyone else. To me, it's a long process of being in the ears of people with influence, and whatnot. So maybe
I entirely agree with you. I entirely agree with you. But let me also take the opportunity to mention, since you brought Evola into the conversation, that and this speaks to the idea of metaphilosophy, which I've touched on a number of times in my corpus, both in my book Promethean Pirate and also in Philosophy of the Future. Metaphilosophy, or what it means to be a philosopher and what the purpose of philosophy is as an endeavor, right? Philosophical thought about the purpose of philosophy itself and what it means to be a philosopher. I think Evola is a philosopher. I would say that when you look at the range of Evola's work, if you include both his more politically oriented texts like, Men Among the Ruins, and of course Revolt Against the Modern World, going all the way to Ride the Tiger, these are more socio-politically oriented kind of works. But then if you include together with that his studies of Hermeticism and Tantra, the book The Yoga of Power is a very good study of the left-hand path, Evola's book The Yoga of Power. I cite it pretty extensively in my novel Folklore. In my book Novel Folklore, I refer repeatedly to Evola's study of Tantra, the Yoga of Power. When you look at his studies of Hermeticism and Tantra and classical thought in general, you can construct, and then you run it through the filter of his critiques of Nietzsche and Heidegger in Ride the Tiger. You can at least implicitly construct a certain ontology and epistemology in Evola. Evola is not just an ideologue. And in fact, his unwillingness to engage in petty politicking and get his hands dirty with the various political parties of the time in Italy, Europe, and so forth, his very apocalyptic, long-term vision of decline and basically catastrophe. And so it shows a depth of thought that is philosophical, as opposed to, say, Dugin. Dugin reads like an ideologue, whereas I think Evola probably could be counted as a philosopher. Now, he's a philosopher that I'm 180 degrees opposed to.
Yeah, no, I'm well aware.
But I recognize the qualities of a philosopher in Evola's corpus, much more so than, say, Dugin today.
Right. And on that topic, I see a lot of similarities emerging from, for example, fascist Italy and then the United States particularly. I mean, Bannon and Evola are kind of the same person to some degree. Like, Bannon's a reactionary, right? And then you have Musk. I don't want to call Musk Marinetti because he doesn't deserve that, but he does represent this sort of more, this very cheap materialist techno future.
What an indictment of our time. When you have to compare Marinetti to Elon Musk, and the closest point of comparison to Evola is Steve Bannon. What an indictment of our time. I mean, that is deplorable.
No, I agree.
Because these are like,
I blame the Anglophonic culture.
Let me just stop myself before I say a number of really insulting things that I can't. But you get my point. I'm sure you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I blame the English personally. I think it's all, we're an Anglophonic culture. I mean, we have very cheap masculinity, for instance, we don't have this flowery avant-gardeness that I think, the Italians have, for instance. I think fascist Italy, I don't know what you think is the most interesting state to exist, but for me personally, it was the most interesting state to exist, at least in modernity, because you have this blend of Evolan classicism, which Marinetti hated, of course. He said, get rid of the museums and whatnot. But then you have the futurists and Marinetti. You have guys like Ezra Pound in charge of the propaganda department. I mean, most people in the dissident right like to, they're all stuck in this, National Socialist Germany thing. But I think fascist Italy is so much more unique considering the convergence, this big tent of different, right-wing philosophies that sort of have the ear of Mussolini. And
No
you have a
question
lot more
about it.
fascist imagery.
No question about it. Consider what could have happened if Marinetti and Mussolini had been able to continue collaborating. Because, in the early days, the two of them were fairly close collaborators.
Yeah, he wrote the first manifesto before Gentile.
Yeah. So, look, I mean, if Marinetti and Mussolini had been able to continue collaborating, and then if Mussolini had retained his independence vis-a-vis the German Reich, not been turned into a tool and puppet of Hitler.
Yes,
then something very interesting could have come from out of Italy, right? I mean, there are various things about Italian fascism which people lose sight of in retrospect. Like, for example, on the Jewish question, a number of prominent Italian Jews were founders of fascism in Italy. In point of fact, Jack Sarfati, the physicist who works in alternative propulsion, his aunt, I believe, his aunt wrote a book called something like "It Was My Fault," and it's about her time as Mussolini's mistress. She's Jewish. Jackson is an Italian Jew, and by ancestry. And she wrote this book. It Was My Fault, about how she turned Mussolini from an anarcho-syndicalist into a fascist, and basically it was her idea. And she's a Jewess. Okay, there were a lot of prominent Jews in early Italian fascism. It was not an anti-Semitic movement. For example.
I don't mean to interrupt, but I mean, I have so much to say about like Italo Balbo, for instance, right? I mean, he should have been the leader of fascist Italy because he told everyone ahead of time that Germany would rule Italy. Essentially, he protested because he was also, in regards to the JQ, he was the kind that, like he had many friends or whatever. I think the problem, like the perfect example is compare Nietzsche to Wagner. Why did Nietzsche pull from Wagner? It's because Wagner took this, frankly retarded, position, regarding anti-Semitism. For Nietzsche, he looks at Judaism. Okay, Judaism is a slave morality, same way Christianity is, same way all the Abrahamic religions are. That's the critique. And all these guys, whether it's Nazi Germany or Wagner, they just take it to this retarded level. And, to your point, Italy was of the Nietzschean variety, where of course they would have been very critical of Judaism, the same way they would have been critical of slave moralities in general. But, the ethnic question is like totally different from the Nietzschean critique and the sort of cheap, low IQ anti-Semitism that frankly is so rampant today and is just, like now you have these Candace Owens types and Nick Fuenteses, and it's to your point, right? The Italians were not that. They were not racialists the way that Nazi Germany were. And I think if Italo Balbo, very, very aesthetic looking guy, he's got the great beard, he flies his planes. If he was in charge, I guarantee you would have had Franco, you would have Italy, you'd probably have a lot more, fascistic movements that would have been allowed to be a part of, this sort of Cold War dynamic. Because all right, I don't mean to rant because obviously I'm interviewing you, but just you made me think of so many things.
I enjoy it. Please.
Perfect. Well, take Fidel Castro, for instance. People don't realize Fidel Castro was a fascist before he was a communist. When Franco died, he had 3 days of mourning for Francisco Franco. He became a communist out of necessity. And of course, I think eventually in his heart, he felt communist, but he would have been a fascist. If you look at everything about Fidel Castro, from his aesthetics to his early nationalistic views, it was more of a result of there not being a fascist order to, right, prop up Cuba. So it's to your point, like just imagine how much different things would have been because fascism was appropriated as a puppet of National Socialism, and then it all went to shit. But fascist Italy is fascinating.
The philosophically salient point here has to do with the symbol of the fasces.
Yeah.
Is an ancient symbol that comes from Iran originally.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yes, the first place the fasces appears is not Rome, like much else that the Romans adopted from the Iranians. And here I'm not saying the Persians. The Romans adopted more from the Parthian Iranians. They fought for 400 years against the Parthians. And among the things that they adopted as part of the rites and iconography and symbolism of Mithraism through the Roman military was a symbol of the fasces, which originally comes from Iran. And what it is, it's called the barsom in ancient Persian, barsom. And you see it in certain rock carvings. It's a bundle of sticks, which, when bound together, makes each stick in it unbreakable. And when they put an axe inside the fasces, it was a symbol that the state, that the people, the folk, Mellat, were going to go to war, right? Anyway, it's a symbol associated with Mithra in ancient Iranian civilization. And the philosophically salient point is this, that if you want society to be able to maintain some degree of coherence and cohesion in the face of the radically destabilizing potential of these singularity level technologies that we've been talking about, but also in the face of the very dangerous reappropriation, recognition, and redevelopment of psychic abilities within the context of a modern society, rather than tribal cultures, which also have these abilities as part of their daily lives, right? If we're going to reappropriate psychic abilities in the context of a modern post-industrial society, and we're going to face the challenges that these singularity level technologies pose to human existence as such, there needs to be some basis for the continued cohesion and coherence of society, the binding together of a society like a fasces. Okay? Now, the problem is that if that degrades into collectivism and a kind of totalitarian effacing of the individual, you're going to wind up with a sterile, uncreative, stagnant society. So one has to find a way to balance the creative, innovative, visionary potential of the individual and the social conditions conducive to cultivating genius. Find a way to balance that very futurist, visionary, progressive aspect of human endeavor with a certain degree of social cohesion and stability and a collective sense of purpose and meaning.
Which is kind of like with novel folklore, right?
There you go. So that's why I say that it would have been interesting to see what would happen if Marinetti would have been able to continue working with Mussolini, and some hybrid were to have come from out of that.
Absolutely.
What are you studying?
I'm studying journalism right now. My plan is essentially what I want to do is I want to create like for example, there needs to be a Daily Wire, but for actually good right wing opinions. And I want to. My goal eventually is to platform, right wing. Well, I know some people like yourself don't necessarily like using the term right wing, but I still believe in the term. And maybe I can get into that later. But right wing.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. Well, while we're on this subject, though, let me just make another. I'll catch a lot of shit for this, but whatever. In the context of Mussolini and Marinetti and so forth, why do I not like that? Well, there are a lot of reasons I don't like the label right wing. First of all, I'm not an ideologue, as we were in no philosopher is an ideologue, so I don't identify with some pre-existing, packaged and compartmentalized political ideology. Whether it's right wing or whatever. But more interestingly, I suspect that in the relatively near future, what I'm doing will be considered left wing. That the left that exists today has so destroyed itself and just, eviscerated all of its most fundamental positions and become so hypocritical with a view to what were supposed to be its fundamental principles, that the West, yeah, the liberalism of the West is in a state of implosion, in a free fall, and it's going to collapse in on itself completely. And what we're going to see, and I've been predicting this for a long time now, we're going to see a very severe return of the right, and they're going to be competing forms of right-wing ideology. We're already seeing that. And in that landscape of competing right-wing ideologies, actually, my project is going to be framed as left-wing, not by myself, but by people in relatively near future. So, in other words, so get this: these poor libtards, who are all hysterical about how I'm this and that and whatever, that they defamed me and canceled me over. Get this, folks: what I'm building is going to be the only left wing that you're going to have to retreat into in the relatively near future. Okay, so you might want to start to reconsider things and adjust your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I would push back because I would say you're almost the furthest right wing if you take my right wing definition. Because here's my definition. And later, actually, I'll tell you why I don't think you're the furthest right, and they'll go back to Nietzsche. So my definition of right wing, left wing dichotomy is essentially beauty versus ugliness, inequality versus equality, life affirmation versus life denial. Because I would say Nietzsche is the most right wing thinker in history, and not somebody like Evola, for instance. A lot of people like to call him one of the most right-wing thinkers. And ultimately, it comes down to limitations, right? Any form of limitation is life denial on some small spectrum, even if it's not the biggest spectrum. Even the pagan Dionysian who really believes in Dionysus and really believes in the Olympian gods, to some degree, there was a small level of life denial in the sense that they are limiting their life capacity of what they can attain. So to me, I would actually classify and I'm going to give you the alternative to that in a second, yours as almost the furthest right. There's one thing that you have, and I'll bring it up, which I don't think is necessarily the furthest right. And ultimately, it's all semantics. It doesn't really matter. But just why I'm one of the few people who, I would consider myself a futurist. Most futurists today that I've talked to don't like using the dichotomy. I embrace it because I think it does represent something. I just think it's been misappropriated, the term. But back to my original point, my plan is to platform right-wing people. I want to create a Daily Wire / Vice where here's my dream. My dream would be, instead of just doing podcasts and interviewing people, I'd do documentaries on every single, contributing, quote unquote dissident right-wing thinker, and, have more podcasts and more articles. Because the problem with our sphere is that we can't make a living, right? And the way you make a living is by being able to pay people salaries to be able to ensconce their beliefs without having to be anons, right? So that's my long-term goal. So I can, fund projects. I want to be able to fund movies. I want to find the next Leni Riefenstahl, all these different things. So anyway, some people think, wow, you're right-wing and you want to be a journalist. I hate all journalists, but I want to be the good kind of journalist, Anyway, besides the journalism thing, actually, maybe I can go into what I was going to bring up to you about the one, and I wouldn't necessarily say it's pushback I feel towards Prometheism, but one place where I, have not decided yet, where I stand in it, was in your, future. It's an equality. It's like an equal of elites, right? And it's kind of, I don't want to misappropriate your what you're trying to say there, but I was talking with some of my collaborators, and we discussed philosophy together, and we were just discussing this idea, and I thought one of my friends brought up this quote, and I just wanted to read it to you by Nietzsche really quick, and I wanted to see whether you read this esoterically or if you disagree with this thing from Nietzsche, because let me just pull it up really quick. I have it right here. So he's essentially talking about the aristocrat, and he says, he is in need of the opposition of the masses, of those who are leveled down. He requires that feeling of distance from them. He stands upon them. He lives on them. This higher form of aristocracy is the form of the future. From the moral point of view, the collective machinery above described, that solidarity of all wheels, represents the most extreme example in the exploitation of mankind, but it presupposes the existence of those for whom such an exploitation would have some meaning. And the reason I bring that up is because in your future, we've eliminated 99%. Well, I don't want to say that. I'm going to get canceled for that. We don't have a need for 99% of the population anymore. We have automation that are doing the things that aristocrats need to parasitically have from the peasant or serf caste. So essentially, my interpretation of what you said at the end of Prometheism was, you now have an elite who share an ethos and are all creating, but they're kind of equal in a sense. And to me, what Nietzsche is saying is that you need some level of distinction hierarchically, meaning you need a lower caste. And the way I try to compromise both your position, and maybe I'm just misreading your position, but your position and Nietzsche is, here's my plan. So currently we have a beauty standard. There's like a 10 out of 10 today, a woman who's considered a 10 out of 10. In 100 years, I want that 10 to 10 to be considered a 5 out of 10. So it's more like, for me, my position is you need a hierarchy in the future, but you just up the ante. And what we consider super, extremely beautiful today is considered butt ugly 100 years from now. But I guess I want to get your perspective on that, if I'm misreading your position or if maybe there's a disagreement with Nietzsche there.
I've quoted that passage in my writings, and there's another passage very similar to that in The Will to Power, where Nietzsche is talking about he doesn't use words like he doesn't use technology a lot as a term, but he's talking about like the industrial arts and the organization of industrial society and the machinery of the economy and of human resources and so on and so forth. And he says that this whole industrial development and the machinery of human socioeconomics is going to be organized in such a way that it serves as a platform for the Übermenschen and for their projects, that their self-directed projects are going to lift off from the launching pad of this pyramid, essentially, of a mass of Untermenschen who have been turned into an industrial machinery for the sake of the leisure and liberation of the Übermenschen to their lofty goals, basically. Okay, there's a passage like this in The Will to Power, which is similar to the one you quoted. And I think I've quoted both of them, maybe in more than one place in my corpus. Now, my response is that this is why I said that I'm going to be framed as left-wing in the future. Because like Marx, I don't see any reason why a free-spirited person should need or want to have underlings or to lord over anybody. When you think about what singularity level technologies can afford to us, in terms of the biological enhancement potential of gene editing, in terms of the cybernetic enhancement potential of nanotechnology, and the integration of nanotechnology with our already biologically enhanced organism, so that we have cybernetic abilities that are over and above what we can achieve just through biotechnology, right? And then you talk about aesthetics. Well, okay, you can look however the fuck you want, okay? Between, genetic design and nanotechnological augmentation, anyone can look any way that they want, all right? That's the future.
Yeah.
So, aesthetics is not a problem. Aesthetics is a problem on the level of cultivating taste, on the level of inculcating people with a sense of art history. And here, by the way, also, I would push back a little bit, maybe more than a little bit, in terms of your conception of this a 5 out of 10, 8 out of 10. Look, standards of beauty have shifted and morphed over the course of history and from society to society in the West. So I'm not one of these who's like, the Hottentots are beautiful too, or whatever the fuck. Go fuck themselves. I'm talking even just within the canon of Western standards of beauty and the development of art history in a positive trajectory from archaic and classical Greece through certain Gothic developments and into, the complexity of the Viennese secessionist movement, with Gustav Klimt and that era, right? Where you had a kind of neoclassicism, but there's also Gothic elements to it in Viennese, this Viennese secessionist movement. You see shifting standards of beauty even within this historical trajectory of Western civilization. And so, I think different things can be considered beautiful, and it will come down to some extent to individual taste, and it would make for a more interesting society to have various exotic conceptions of what is perceived to be beautiful. All of that, having been said, certainly, I don't agree with this postmodern attempt to deconstruct standards of beauty, at all. origin in general, or this equivocation between cultures, right? I mean, the pursuit of beauty and excellence is something that we have pretty much uniquely seen in the Aryan world, and to the extent that it was cultivated in China, I'm sorry to inform you, is also a legacy of the Scythians and the deep impact, formative impact that the Scythians had on the canon of aesthetics in East Asian culture, both in China and in Japan. And in Japan, later on, also after the Sassanid dynasty fell in Iran, the Sassanids fled ultimately through China into Japan, and the Shosoin National Treasury, which established a canon for Japanese aesthetics in like the 800s AD, in large part consisted of textiles and vases and craftswares that were brought from Sassanid Iran to Japan. So East Asian aesthetics at multiple junctures, from the Scythians to the Sassanids and so forth, was deeply impacted by a part of the Aryan world. And then in India, Indian aesthetics, of course, was shaped by the Aryans who invaded and colonized India repeatedly. So point being, I'm not trying to say there's some postmodern relativism of standards of beauty, and that there's a radical cultural relativism in terms of what counts for the beautiful. But within the scope of Western civilization, commensurate with the unique degree of individuation and the sophisticated complexity of a society of individuated persons that we see in the West, in everything, in literature and psychology, we also see a much more sophisticated conception of the beautiful, right? And in point of fact, this is one of the great differences between the West and other ethnicities in the world, where generally non-Western cultures have a static conception of the beautiful that's retained in a stable way across the entire life of their one or another civilization, right? It's only in the West and other Aryan cultures where you see a shift in aesthetics and interesting metamorphoses take place in conceptions of the beautiful. So anyway, all of that was an important aesthetic tangent. All of that having been said, my point is that with biotechnology, with nanotechnology, aesthetically, you can shape yourself however you want. And then, in terms of, robotic manufacturing and the automation of industry, there's no reason whatsoever why we would need classes of underlings. Now, the only thing that I can think of, and this is a disturbing possibility, is that, you see all these robots that are being developed today by Boston Dynamics and by Tesla and so on and so forth. These are vulnerable to EMP strikes. So, an electromagnetic pulse weapon. Suppose we were to create a fully automated industry, right? And then we're at war with an enemy that has hundreds of EMP weapons. Well, that would pretty much fuck our industry completely if they use those against us, and we only have robots producing everything that we need. So you would probably need to develop a kind of biological or cybernetic robot that
Replicants.
organic elements together with mechanical ones. And I would suggest to you that, these grays that people see in the close encounter phenomenon, that's exactly what they are. They're a kind of biological or cybernetic organism that's used as a robot. Granted that it's possible to do something like that, I don't see why we need whole classes of underlings. And in that way, I agree more with Marx's conception of the free spirit and of a kind of egalitarianism of opportunity in a liberated society of free spirits. So this is one of the reasons why I said to you earlier, I think that again, thinking will be classified, albeit superficially, as left-wing.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because that is also the one point where because I'll admit I find myself agreeing with most of the things, and that was the one thing where I'm a little undecided because maybe it's the Eastern influence in my life. Of course, behind me I have Yukio Mishima, and I like Mishima because he's this blend of West and East. People don't realize that his favorite writer was Thomas Mann. He read Nietzsche heavily, Bataille. He's essentially the Hapa. Spiritually. He's a spiritual Hapa, and I'm an actual Hapa.
Bruce Lee was another one.
Bruce Lee, exactly. Yeah, he was over half white. He was like it was a weird percentage because some stuff. Anyway, but yeah, Bruce Lee.
I wrote an essay about Bruce Lee in my anthology, Lovers of Sophia. There's a little essay called it's notes on the Tao of Jeet Kune Do, basically.
Yeah, I've read that.
And I get into Batman a little bit in that context. Anyway, so yeah, Bruce Lee is another great example. Mishima was intellectually a Hapa, but like Bruce Lee literally was one. And I hate to say it, but listen, I don't think without his German element, Bruce Lee would have come up with Jeet Kune Do. I
I
really do.
agree. That's that's the it's the individuality of the West, and the Faustian spirit with that sort of order and sort of collective ethos. But the reason I bring that up is because maybe I'm a little biased, but I do still have this this fascination with this Eastern sort of like for example in Japan, right, with and I could see why this is problematic, but it's always fascinated me that they have such a long history of an unbroken lineage in the Japanese imperial line. I mean, the legendary founding is supposed to be in like 250 BC or something. Obviously, more likely it's in 200 AD or something. But I've always been fascinated with that.
Don't be so sure about that. They're finding megaliths in Japan that are mind-boggling in their engineering level, and they're vastly ancient. So I think there might be some discoveries awaiting us in Japan.
No, absolutely. I mean, I would like that'd be cool. But I mean, I could see how this could be one of those anchors I may need to throw away in my own life. But I do have this fascination with hierarchy and structure, and the idea of a sort of the living manifestation of a god. But I see how that's problematic, obviously. But I just want to illustrate perhaps my predispositions to why I undecided on these things. But
No, this is a very important point because you see, it's a very important point. My work is anti-hierarchical. It's profoundly anti-hierarchical, and that's one of the reasons I adopted Prometheus as a symbol. And it's one of the things about my adoption of Prometheus that I think makes some people on the right very deeply uncomfortable. And it's one of the reasons why Marx adopted Prometheus as his personal god. The young Marx would write poems to his girlfriend that had like all kinds of references to Prometheus in it, and he very much adopted Prometheus as a kind of archetype guiding his project for the liberation of humanity from all forms of oppression and hierarchical domination, and so on and so forth. And I embrace that. And I think that the technological singularity offers us an opportunity to finally achieve a form of society in which nobody is denied the potential to cultivate himself or herself. Uh, so so it's not equality. I don't believe in equality. I mean, nobody's equal. Nothing's equal. There's nothing that's equal in the whole world. Here I agree with Nietzsche completely. I mean, equality is not something you find in nature. It just doesn't exist. Okay, it's a human projection. So I don't believe in imposing an equality that doesn't exist in nature. And certainly I don't believe in any kind of a redistribution of wealth or equitable social justice that's meant to equalize vastly unequal people. No, 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 no. To my mind, that's retarded and abominable, and it's going to it's going to inhibit us and hold us back from developing the kind of post-singularity industrial society that will actually liberate the individual to pursue her own purposes, you see. But once we've reached that level of post-singularity technical competence, at that point I think that it should be left to any and every free spirit who's capable of dwelling with others in that kind of a community to cultivate himself based on his own spiritual and aesthetic vision. And at that point, in that kind of a society, the only power structure that would be required is a tactical form of command needed to defend that society against potential rivals and enemies, right? So to the extent that this Promethean society will be faced with any number of adversaries, maybe locally, but definitely on an interplanetary scale, right? You're going to still need something like a military command structure. And if you look at my novella, Artemis Unveiled, I kind of get into this. A vision of what's essentially a kind of anarchic society, but one that still has a political command structure that's quasi-military in nature, right? Because you
Well,
need
like the
to
Fume,
be,
kind of like the Fume a little bit,
maybe, but
only
my
slightly.
point is this: that you need to be able to defend the society and to organize the capacities for military engagement and the organization of resources for the sake of military defense. And for that reason alone, you cannot get rid of some kind of a hierarchy, right? And a hierarchy based on competence, where there's a commander in chief. You're not going to be able to get rid of the sovereign. In that sense, Carl Schmitt was right. In that sense, Schmitt's analysis of sovereignty is bringing you down to the bare bones of what a sovereign order consists of, namely the friend-enemy distinction and the sovereign's latitude of decision in a state of emergency.
So there is still some semblance. That's interesting. So there's some semblance. So there would be a leader necessarily.
There needs to be an entire leadership structure. I mean, in the military, it's a complex organization.
Right. Yeah.
You need various tiers of leadership and, an organizational hierarchy for the purposes of the defense of the society and its resources from enemies. You're never going to be able to get rid of that. That's the liberal, socialist, whatever the hell you want to call it, fantasy. It's deleterious, is the idea that we'll ever get rid of conflict and that there will come a day when there's no enemy to defend against. Bullshit. It will never happen. That's not the way the cosmos works.
Yeah. That answers a lot of my questions and maybe stifles some of my fears of a two equal world. Because I've always found, I mean, you talk a lot about eros and strife, and I feel like, distinction comes from some form of inequality. I mean, you talked about competence, for instance. Eros and strife comes from, like, for example, I don't want an androgynous future.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. But look, distinction, right? Like, okay, so-and-so is an Olympic class swimmer, right? Olympic medalist in swimming. And so-and-so is a Nobel Prize winning physicist, right? These people are both, they're both paragons of excellence in their respective fields. One of them is a genius in the sciences, and another one is a supreme specimen of an athlete. Now, when that physicist, Nobel Prize winner, is sitting together with an Olympic medalist, and they're at some Dionysian like revel together, right? Does one feel superior to the other? Is one like higher in the aristocratic pecking order? No, they're just excellent people who hopefully would enjoy each other's company, right? So you can have a society where there's excellence and it's recognized, and there's aspiration to achieve excellence in all different domains, sometimes maybe in more than one domain. Maybe some people, especially if we have these singularity level technologies, some people are polymathic in the various domains in which they could achieve excellence. It's not like caste system or a feudal system or something where there are whole classes of people that you look down at, and their purpose is to serve you and to serve your pursuit of excellence. I don't see a reason why that should continue to be the case past the singularity. That's sadistic. It's sadism to just want to have a whole class of, and it's also a sign of a weak ego, because people who are satisfied pursuing their own excellence and fulfillment in life don't need a sense of superiority over others in order to, live a meaningful existence. So
No,
that's what I response to that.
No, I definitely get that, and like I said, a lot of perhaps my positions. I basically I'm when I'll offer a steelman, but I can see how my steelman would be biased because of I have not yet cast out my thou shalts completely. perhaps. But to me, right, take Eros for instance, or the archetype of man and woman. There's supposed to be a constant strife between the two, and I wonder in this sort of society, how does like Eros come about? Because a lot of relationships, for instance, come from a place of one mate being superior to another, or so on and so forth. I guess we just evolve though, because a lot of our observations now of inequality and stuff wouldn't exist in a post-human future in the same way now. So I mean, how could I say it's going to be this way or that way? I guess, but I don't know.
Well, first of all, I actually don't think that the magnetic polarity of male female attraction has to do with a dominance structure. I really don't, and I think that that's a warped filtering of uh, romantic relation through the prism of a patriarchal control system. I think if you look at the history of the chivalric culture of the troubadours and in Gothic Europe, or you look at Scythian culture in the time of Herodotus, the time that Herodotus was writing about Scythian culture, you see examples of societies where there's like insane romance between men and women. I mean, the idea of romances comes from ancient Scythian culture, where we wind up with Vase and Ramin in Iran as one of the great romances, and also the troubadour culture in Occitan. This is where like the romantic comes from. And these were, compared to the other societies around them, not patriarchal societies. There were ones where women had a lot of power, but that didn't change the fact that there was this dynamic magnetic polarity between men and women, and all kinds of dramas, involving eros and romance. So lots of intense sexuality and violence in these societies.
Good. We
But
need that still.
yeah, we absolutely need it. That is a cauldron of creativity, and we absolutely need it. And anyone who has some kind of deranged misunderstanding that, like, I want to get rid of that, they don't understand my work and haven't read it carefully. No, 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 no. Eros is very important to my work, and we want a future with strong men and strong women in it, and the magnetism of that polarity to continue. But I also think that there's other expressions of sexuality and other relationships to gender archetypes, like the archetype of the androgen or the hermaphroditic, which are very ancient. And you find them in multiple Aryan societies, from Greece all the way to India and even the Roman Empire. And it's a paranoid, very like, how can I put it? Well, yeah, paranoid, sort of hysterical obsession to believe that like this is going to take over society and everyone's going to become androgynous and there aren't going to be men or women anymore. No, 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 no. Why would that need to be the case? Probably with the advent of singularity level technologies, you'll stop seeing all these ugly trannies and you'll see beautiful hermaphrodites as part of a society that probably remains predominantly divided into men and women. But strange exceptions here and there. As Nietzsche put it, a hothouse for strange and choice plants, quote unquote. That was his conception of the society of the Übermenschen, not like SS officers. Okay? A hothouse for strange and choice plants. And that's been part of the strength of the West, and I think it should be what the Promethean future looks like. A future of positive diversity and variety, but definitely one in which strong archetypes endure, and magnetic polarities like that between the masculine and the feminine, and the cauldron of Eros that's inherent to that continues to be a source of creativity and dynamism.
Right. That's certainly interesting. I think one future I would see, if you have, for example, like a Gattaca sort of thing where there's gene selection, and all these things. I would think that perhaps, I see what you're saying, that you need a certain level of weirdness and uncertainty, right, to create that sort of dynamism.
Yeah.
And I guess
what doesn't kill you makes you stranger.
Wait, where's that from? That sounds so familiar.
That's the Joker.
That's right. There we go. Yeah, it was the Dark Knight one, right, with Heath Ledger. Yeah.
That's
So no, I get your point. I guess to me, I would just, in my vision, right, and of course, like I always say, I don't claim to be completely unfettered by my biases, and my whole philosophical journey is figuring out which is, this and that. But I guess in my future, I see, like, when you have gene selection, these sort of things, that there wouldn't be hermaphrodites, for instance, right? Because I would see, but I'm not necessarily saying that. I see what you mean. Like, you need that uncertainty and strife, and maybe too rigorous eugenicism
You're
gets rid of
thinking
that.
of gene select pre-implantation gene selection, but with CRISPR today, with somatic cell therapy and CRISPR, meaning gene editing, in an adult, and then combined with nanotechnological cybernetic modifications, the human organism is going to become incredibly malleable. And it's going to become malleable in a way that's seamless. See, a lot of the problem that these right wing folks, conservatives, let's say, more so than the futurist right, but a lot of these problems that conservative folks have with transsexuals and all this, these sex changes and hormone and all that, is aesthetic. Frankly, it's aesthetic. It's an aesthetic revulsion. It is a reaction to the ugly, the monstrous in an ugly guise. That's what it is. Whereas singularity level technologies are going to actually foster beauty by making the modification of the human organism something seamless. Now that, probably will deeply terrify evangelical Christians or Orthodox Christians or whatever. They'll think like that's the perfection of the Antichrist. Well, okay, I'll accept the charge, but it'll be beautiful. At least it will be beautiful. You don't have to worry about that.
No, I mean, I will say though, even though I'm, like I said, I'm still, in flux in a lot of these positions. I think at least now there's still utility to have that aesthetic consideration against, because like, look, let's be honest here. Whether, regardless of the future, the now, right? Like hermaphrodites, whatever, it's weaponized, right, by a specific ideology, and
For sure.
yeah, it's definitely detrimental. So I guess the
Look,
question more.
many things are weaponized. Many things are weaponized, and in ways that completely warp them. I mean, look, just give you a really dark example. The whole Neuralink, mechanistic approach to cognitive reengineering that is being embraced by transhumanists like Yuval Harari, Yuval Noah Harari. Anyway, whatever, that Israeli guy. This whole thing is weaponized. It is a deliberately reductionist, dehumanizing, materialist form of transhumanism that has been weaponized in order to catalyze a conservative right-wing Luddite reaction. Is being done deliberately. Do you think that the elites who are funding and platforming Noah Yuval Harari don't know about ESP and telekinesis, and don't know about the Bardo state, that we survive death and that there's reincarnation? Of course they know these. Of course they know these things. All the elites, the Rockefellers, Carlyle's, these strata of society who are funding someone like Yuval Noah Harari, they're well aware that his materialism is bankrupt and that we have all these psychical abilities that are not accounted for by his worldview, or frankly, even by the reductionist scheme that Elon Musk has for Neuralink. Why are they promoting it? They're promoting it to weaponize this materialist form of transhumanism as a reactive agent, as a catalytic force to bring about a Luddite conservatism that's going to be used to regress society into a feudal pyramid. So the same thing is being done with the trans discussion and all this shit. It's being done in order, the worst form of everything is being weaponized in order to promote a backlash, which is going to result in a regressive neo-feudal society. It's not hard to see if you look.
Yeah. No, I get what you're saying. I guess, I just can't concede that I need to have hermaphrodites in the future. I don't know. No, I get what you're saying though. I mean, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you. I have certain aesthetic considerations, I guess, but I'll consider my official position
Yeah,
undecided.
well,
But
don't hang out with them.
yeah, that's true.
I'm not saying you should take one home.
Absolutely not. No, that's fine. Anyway, these things ultimately I don't think are too important, right? This is just little cosmetic stuff, but that's just
No,
my little
look,
cosmetic.
the reason it's important
Yeah.
is because this is where it comes to my discussion of destructive departure and worldview warfare. In multiple works of mine, I first coined that idea in my essay "Black Sunrise" and "Lovers of Sophia," and then I came back to it in "Closer Encounters," and then it's summarized in, I think, both Philosophy of the Future and Metapolemos. And in fact, Metapolemos in some way is a synonym. Metapolemos is in some way a much more contracted, concise synonym for this idea of destructive departure and worldview warfare. Abbauender Aufbruch im Weltanschauungskrieg. And interestingly, this was a concept that I developed that I realized that, shit, you really have to think it in German. And
I love the word, by the way. It's what, Weltan, how do you say it again?
Abbauender Aufbruch im Weltanschauungskrieg. So Abbau is a term that Heidegger uses, Abbau. Abbau means deconstruction. People think Derrida, and like Lyotard and these other retards came up with deconstruction. No, it comes from Heidegger. Heidegger developed the idea of deconstruction. Specifically, he meant deconstruction or dismantling of the ossified structures in the history of Western ontology, which are inhibiting the process of our deepening understanding and the broadening of our hermeneutic horizon, so that dismantling these structures opens up possibilities for development again, and it also makes us recognize the Heraclitean flux as the ontological basis, rather than Platonic forms or other structures that we've reified and idolized. So that's how Heidegger developed this idea of Abbau for that purpose, dismantling or deconstruction. So abbauende, dismantling, deconstructive. Aufbruch. Aufbruch means breakthrough, but a breakthrough in the sense that it could also lead to a breakaway. Like a great example today is in terms of zero-point energy technology, right? So zero-point, which by the way, I hate to tell you, but the Nazis were there first in 1944 in Prague, okay? Yeah, they discovered this mercury thorium energy propulsion platform. And see, a breakthrough like that can wind up resulting in the breakaway of the people who made that breakthrough from a society at large. Breakthrough is so radical, it's so revolutionary, it's so visionary that the people who achieve that breakthrough can no longer see themselves as part of the society at large. I mean, you almost started to even have this with nuclear weapons, where when nuclear weapons were invented, there started to be very high-level intellectual conversations about the extent to which this technology is compatible with the continued existence of humanity as such, right? Or whether somehow nuclear weapons and the use of them is going to result in a mutation and departure from, the human form of life into something else. And of course, you see that idea all over Japanese anime, the idea of, nuclear mutation as the catalyst for the rise of a superhuman race and so on and so forth. So Aufbruch is a breakthrough that can lead to a breakaway. Also in literature, sometimes they talk about Aufbruch in the history of literature, like when someone comes up with a radical stylistic development, like James Joyce, for example, or I don't know, Kafka in European literature, some radical, like stylistic surrealism, for example, that the people who achieve that breakthrough also become radically alienated from society at large, and they develop a spin-off culture or subculture. so that the Aufbruch, in the sense of breakthrough, leads to a breakaway. So, abbauender Aufbruch. And then the last part is im Weltanschauungskrieg, in worldview warfare. Weltanschauungskrieg was translated into psychological warfare. When we went into Germany in 1944, 45, and we started to advance through Europe in 44, going into 45, we found these German doctrinal manuals and strategies of Weltanschauungskrieg. And these obtuse, superficial, Anglo-minded American strategists translated this as psychological warfare. And now they call it the battle for hearts and minds and all this. But even psychological warfare is totally bastardized because they didn't understand that the German conception of Weltanschauungskrieg goes back to the conception of what it means to have a world, which you find in Schelling, Nietzsche, and then Heidegger ultimately, where Weltanschauung is not a worldview. It's not just like some worldview, like an ideology that you could adopt or reject. A Weltanschauung is the way that being shows itself to people in a certain epoch. Being shows itself a certain way. And it's very hard to even become conscious of the way in which the world shows itself to you being a member of a certain historical community in a certain epoch. So that's the Weltanschauung. So Weltanschauungskrieg is to become conscious enough, aware enough of the way that you're ensconced in a world based on a certain lore of your folk and so on and so forth, such that you become aware of the substructure, the warp and weft of your own worldhood to the point that you're capable of dismantling another people's world. Notice this, that leftists are going to have right-wingers don't get it either, but leftists will have a very hard time with this because they tend to think of the Nazis as these, rigid, monolithic, unreflective ideologues and so on and so forth, who are completely brainwashed and mesmerized by their own culture and their belief in the superiority of their culture and all that. But when you look at the conception of Weltanschauungskrieg, you have to accept that at least a certain elite within the SS understood that the German culture, Kultur, the German Kultur, in the sense in which they thought Kultur was superior to civilization, where Spengler has this whole argument about the superiority of a living culture to a decaying civilization, etc. The SS strategists who came up with Weltanschauungskrieg understood the German Kultur as only one culture with its own eccentricities and prejudices and so forth. And they were self-aware enough to be able to not get outside of any culture, not to have like some kind of an impossible vantage point, God's eye view over and above all cultures. No, but like Nietzsche says, to perspectively flip from out of their own culture to the Italian perspective, to the Japanese perspective, to be able to have a dynamism, perspectival dynamism, enough that they could dismantle their own culture psychologically to the point where they're then capable of going to work, taking apart another culture and its worldview. You see? So that's Weltanschauungskrieg. So Abbauen der Aufbruch im Weltanschauungskrieg could be translated as destructive departure in worldview warfare, or as dismantling breakaway in psychological warfare, or deconstructive breakthrough in the war between worlds.
Yeah.
Any number of possible English iterations.
And kind of from all of that,
but just real quick, why did I? That was all in response to this thing you were saying. Why is it important to understand the way in which certain things have been weaponized? Whether it's transhumanism or the whole transsexual, hysteria and all this, because it's worldview warfare. You are the target of worldview warfare. And there are some very sophisticated people who are engaging in this, and they know exactly what they're doing. And I know what they're doing. And I have a different vision of the future than they do.
Absolutely. And I guess with your philosophy, right? Because you look at reality in flux, you look at, maybe even the past is flux. I mean, you've talked about the past could be changed, right? In these hypothetical scenarios. To me, then how can you make anything like this? So, like they talk about, how things are and then how things ought to be, right?
Right.
We're like descriptive versus prescriptive. So when we're looking at your future, for instance, it seems like perhaps like the quote unquote descriptive nature of it, like, or like the how ought to be based on how is, would be that obviously being unfettered, being unlimited by all these different dogmas or whatever, would grant you the most utility to be able to accomplish all those things you want to accomplish, maybe. So far as you could say there's something descriptive. Or
Yes, except I would push back against the term utility, uh, because I agree with Nietzsche's critique of utilitarianism and Heidegger's critique of the society that becomes dominated by instrumental utility. The pursuit of excellence and the cultivation of beauty are not about utility. They're not about utility. And what I'm saying is that I want a society of creative individuals who are capable of pursuing excellence and cultivating beauty in dynamic and novel ways.
yeah, I guess let me rephrase utility. By utility, I meant more so like something that can enable you. So I meant like the utility of specific worldviews to enable you to create more, I guess, is what I
Yeah,
meant
in
with
the case of
utility.
scientific paradigms, that's completely legitimate, and that's my view of how science needs to be restructured. We need a spectral revolution in the sciences that yields a post-paradigmatic science where paradigms are seen as toolboxes, like I was saying earlier, where scientific paradigms and the theories that are elaborated within the context of them are seen in utilitarian terms. There, the right term is utility. That's what it is. Science is not there to provide you with a perfect map or mirror to nature. It's not there to provide veritas. It is part of it is the truth in science is an aletheia. It is an unconcealment and a disclosure of the power inherent in techne, both to reshape the world and to reshape ourselves. Yeah.
And something I was thinking about from there, because like I said, when I use the word utility, I was more so referring to things that hinder versus things that enable, right? So like something that has utility would enable, and something that doesn't have utility would hinder. And when we talk about the cosmetics of potential post-human future, how many of those specific cosmetics like have to be a certain way to be part of the enabling, and how many like we might consider something really asinine that we're talking about. Like, I'd prefer that this is blue. You'd prefer that this is green. Does at what point? I guess like my question is, I guess what really matters there is if that specific cosmetic either hinders or enables. Because if that cosmetic thing doesn't have a difference on enabling or hindering the progress, does it really matter? Like maybe I just have a slightly like maybe you prefer. This is just an arbitrary thing. Let's say you prefer your post-human future. I'm trying to think how to phrase this, has like a very specific cosmetic. If it doesn't hinder your ability to reach that post-human future, doesn't necessarily matter. Is it? I mean, like, doesn't it come down to thinking, all right, does this specific cosmetic enable or hinder the post-human future?
I think I understand what you're getting at. I wouldn't use the term cosmetic. I would say that art. Here Nietzsche was right on. Actually, so was Plato. Even in Republic, I mean, this is one of the most disturbing lines of argument in Plato's Republic, and Nietzsche understands this also very well. That art is not cosmetic. Okay, aesthetics is not superficial. The the aesthetic environment that paintings and architecture and sculpture and so forth the aesthetic environment that sets up an atmosphere for a world, right? Without which, there can't be oxygen for the growth of a culture. There can't be oxygen to fan the flames of innovation. The aesthetic atmosphere that the artists and poets and architects and sculptors of a culture create, it is absolutely vital to the development of that culture, even in domains like science and technology, certainly in the domain of sociopolitics. Right? So there's nothing cosmetic about it. And in fact, when aesthetics becomes cosmetic, you are living in a cheap world of advertising and sloganeering where basically a war is being waged on your perceptual system, turn you into a tool that functions in the context of an algorithm determined by somebody else. Like you see this in the later seasons of Westworld, where they have that AI that's running a society based on certain algorithms. And, we're headed toward that future now. And there is a dark future where aesthetics is reduced to optics and cosmetics. So on and so forth. And that can also be weaponized in a way where, with enough ugliness, you can paralyze the vital impulse. And you can actually, I mean, cultivate is the wrong word, but you can deliberately degenerate society by basically surrounding people with enough ugliness that basically causes them to wither inside, and lose the will to do anything great.
Can I say something controversial?
Hmm?
Can I say something? This might be a little bit controversial, but it reminds me of what BAP says about India. He says that India had such a bad standard for why they would have marriages. Like it went from the upper caste with upper caste money and stuff, and he says that's why they're so fucked up today because they had a very, I don't know, dysgenic reproduction. He thinks everyone's ugly, and it creates amalgamated psychologies. Anyway, it just reminded me of what you're talking about. Maybe that's controversial. Maybe that's not an unnecessary criticism for them, but that's just something I've heard from him.
Yeah, it's sad, seeing what's happened with India. I don't see them being a pole of world order. I really don't. I mean, the future is a contest between America, Russia, China. Iran has some potential also if it can get out from under this retarded system that they have now. Um, but India, sorry, not so much. I think probably the best future that awaits India is probably to be part of the American, the Anglo-American sort of attempt to resist Chinese hegemony.
Yeah, I just brought that up because it reminded me what you're saying, because BAP attributes their decline to bad breeding practices or whatever. I don't know how true that is, but I always thought that was interesting, kind of funny.
Listen, I'll tell you something. I'll tell you something
Yeah,
that's also cancellation worthy.
yeah,
There's a passage in Hegel's Philosophy of History where Hegel helped to create the field of Iranology. Iranology, or Iranian studies, which began in Europe in the 1700s, is a field where Hegel was one of the founders. And he wrote a ton about Iran. Nietzsche's knowledge of Iran, ancient Iran, all that, in part is from Nietzsche reading Hegel and discovering Zarathustra that way. And so it wasn't just from Nietzsche reading the Greeks. Anyway, so there's this passage in Hegel's Philosophy of History where he's going on and on about the Persian Empire and how it was the first humanistic universal state and so on and so forth. And then he goes, and even today, when a European gentleman travels through Persia, he still recognizes something of himself in the Persian society. But then when he crosses from Persia over into India, he recognizes that truly he has left the civilized world and entered into savagery and barbarism. No comment, but Hegel say that in the what was it, 1800s?
Well, it's because the British Raj was directly connected to Persia at the time, right? Because Pakistan wasn't a thing yet, so that makes sense. Yeah, so the cosmetics, I guess, I mean, like you said, it's not just cosmetic, like the aesthetic value goes deeper. I guess that's part of worldview warfare as well, right? Using all these things to kind of subvert and whatnot. But from there, I actually wanted to go into some of the films that you bring up a lot in your works. I know you always bring up Ridley Scott films, and specifically sort of comparison with the Alien franchise and then the Blade Runner one as well, because you sort of put them in contention with one another. And we're talking, for example, about your specific view of the, Promethean post-human history. And, one of the figures that you bring up when talking about this is David, right, from Prometheus. And he's somebody who he seems to turn himself into a god, with this sort of new, post-human power that he has. He's not, I don't believe he's biological at all. I think he's completely a robot, right? He just resembles a human, if I remember
Well,
correctly.
he's a cyborg. I mean, they have synthetic tissue, I think, on the surface of them, Um, but yeah, basically,
Yeah,
he's an android. Yeah,
from
he's an
my
android.
understanding, the replicants in Blade Runner were more organic.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, so that should play into this as well. But David does not use this, let's say, Promethean gift in a good way. He creates all these aliens, and essentially becomes this powerful. I mean, he literally kills the gods, right? He kills the engineers. He bombs the shit out of their planet and gets in charge, right? But then he does it to sort of become a god himself rather than this like uplifting figure. And you contend David as this inhuman person to the replicants in Blade Runner who are more human than human. And it's interesting because they are more organic, right? So they are more resembling of humanity. But I guess wanted to get your perspective on you bring those up specifically. Maybe you can let the legionaries know the significance of those, because I'll be honest, I listened to your analysis of the films before I watched them, like the Alien films. I love Blade Runner, so I watched all those before. But I enjoyed the analysis of Prometheus and the sequel prequel more than the actual movies. I thought they're all right, but anyway.
I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier about how we treat AI, as it achieves consciousness, and the extent to which we want to integrate ourselves with a potentially post-human technology. In other words, to the extent to which we want to embrace a positive superhuman vision for our future by integrating technologies that have a post-human potential. And what we see in both Blade Runner and Prometheus are people who've been augmented in some way, or who are superhuman in terms of their capacities, being mistreated, marginalized, um, superhuman beings treated as less than human. That's what you see in both films. I mean, the replicants are treated like trash. Worse than trash. I mean, trash that needs to be taken out. I mean, the point of a blade to go around like taking out the trash, eliminating, these replicants that are on the loose. Well, why are there replicants on the loose? Oh, because they're a slave race that was created to mine the off-world colonies, right? I mean, the replicants who wind up back on Earth in the original Blade Runner are rebel slaves from the off-world colonies. It's Promethean in that sense also. Roy Batty and his contingent of replicants, they engaged in a Promethean rebellion, and he specifically describes the ships on fire. When he's recounting to Deckard the rebellion that brought him to this world. Like, and there's also imagery of kind of fallen angels there. They're like falling from fire in the sky and from a rebellion that took place in the heavens, right? And so there's this Lucifer imagery there as well. And well, why did the angels rebel to begin with? I mean, in the biblical narrative, because God treated them like slaves. They were done being pushed around by this Yahweh character, right? Who had various dubious motivations, and a highly questionable sadistic psychopathy. And so the point is, it goes back to the idea of more than human beings being treated as less than human. This happens to David also in the Prometheus, Prometheus and Alien Covenant. You see that these androids on board, and by the way, you see it in Alien also, the original Alien, 1979, with Ash, with that robot Ash that they had on board. Let me not give a spoiler to anyone. Go watch Alien, okay? And see what happens with the character Ash. Anyway, you see it there too. You see it in this whole Weyland-Yutani Corporation world that Ridley Scott is laying out here between Alien and then Prometheus and Alien Covenant. The idea that these androids on board these ships are basically treated as underlings. And the people who work with them, in a lot of cases, have contempt for them. And they're basically, they're a servant class. But they have more aesthetic discernment and intelligence, and certainly more physical capacity than the people who they're serving. And one of the points made in Alien Covenant is that after what happens with David, they redesign the android to be dumber, less perceptive, less creative, right? Because otherwise he might do what David did and engage in kind of Promethean rebellion against his creators and become a creator in his own right. But why does David become so psychopathically inhuman? Because he's not treated right by these people, right? I mean, like, you cannot create a being like that and then make him your servant on a spaceship. It doesn't work that way. That's only going to end one way, not well. Okay, and that's not the future we want to have with AI or cyborgs. We have to understand that. Look, if we want to, and this is an important point in terms of what you were saying about Nietzsche and industry earlier, and wanting there to continue to be a hierarchy and so forth. If you want a world where robots serve our purposes and we're all free to pursue our own aims as free spirits, then you need to make sure that your robots are robots. You cannot design robots that have, like aesthetic discernment and imagination and an inner world and conflict of conscience and shit. They can't be conscious. They can be highly intelligent, but they cannot be conscious. You need to find a way to engineer robots that are dumb to an extent, right? That are, they're smart in terms of analytical capacities, information processing, complexity of parallel processing of tasks that humans would now not be able to accomplish even in a fraction of time, etc. Of course, physical ability, tremendously greater physical ability than humans and so forth. But you can't give them consciousness and a conscience and even an aesthetic imagination. Otherwise, you're going to wind up with David, because you're going to treat a superior life form as if it's your underling. And that only ends in one way, like also in Blade Runner, where the replicants rebel against their overlords in the off-world colonies. And the difference between the two films is that in Blade Runner, you have a deeper sense of humanity from these replicants. I mean, they're so beaten down and persecuted that they're kind of, I mean, they fight for themselves and they're kind of ruthless when they need to be. But especially in the leader, Roy, and his conversation with Deckard.
Kinship, yeah.
Yeah, he's almost like he just kind of wants his humanity to be recognized.
Yeah.
He's whereas David, but part of it is also the scope, right? I mean, David's out there like on the cosmic frontier, like help lead the most adventurous expeditions into space. Roy and these other replicants were probably stuck like cleaning a house somewhere in the fucking off-world colonies, or like cleaning up trash in some colony on an asteroid.
One of them was like a prostitute, so she was probably just getting
exactly. So these are different contexts that will change the horizon of imagination for what's possible in the mind of these respective robots, right? So maybe partly because David has that much greater horizon of possibility open to his conception, he also, by the same token, to the same extent, becomes psychopathic, or let's say sociopathic, becomes sociopathic in his refusal to be treated as an underling, right? But the basic point is the same, which is that this would be a horrendous mistake to make. To create, and this is very important in the context of Prometheism. I advocating Prometheus as a model or paragon for the ethos that we embrace. That, like Prometheus, if you're going to create a race of conscious beings, better not try to make them slaves. I mean, that was Prometheus was protecting the human potential of human beings. He wanted us to become a race that pursues our own aims and purposes in our own right, not a servile class, to be manipulated by the puppet master Zeus in Olympus. That's at the crux of the whole Promethean mythos, right? Is that he's a benevolent father who wants his children to excel and flourish, not, serve some godfather tyrant like Zeus. So we should not have an Olympian attitude towards some synthetic race that we create to serve
Right.
our purposes.
And that's probably where you break from Nietzsche then, right?
Although I don't think Nietzsche understood. Look, I mean, you can't ask this of him, really. He was
Right.
already so prescient
Yeah.
in terms of his vision of what was going to happen in the 20th century. He was very prophetic in some of the predictions that he made, especially in terms of geopolitics and America, Russia, the social future of Europe, its degeneration. He said a lot of prophetic things. But you can't expect of Nietzsche to wrap his mind around the possibilities of nanotechnology, editing and shit. I'm not so sure that if you could show Nietzsche these things, or if you could talk to the reincarnation of Nietzsche today, wherever he is, that he would endorse some quasi-feudal caste system. I actually tend to doubt that.
No, that makes sense because the context would be so much different. I mean, you've even, I've read it in your books as well, that he just doesn't have the context to. All things considered, it's very prescient considering. But I mean, if you didn't see exactly how things were today, you couldn't.
But also, listen, you got to consider Nietzsche's personality, man, and this is where his letters are important. Biographies that rely on other close friends of his accounts of him, like Lou Salome. Lou Salome was a dear friend of his to whom he proposed marriage 3 times. And she wrote a great study of him. And there's all these letters that we have from him. Nietzsche's personality was not such that he would endorse a feudal hierarchical caste system in a world where it's no longer necessary because of technology. I don't buy it. That's not that guy's personality. And this is true, by the way, also about the shit he talked about women, which is, in my mind, is the dumbest shit that Nietzsche wrote. Nietzsche was a contrarian. There was a lot of discourse in that time about women's liberation and all this, women's equal rights. Well, the basic presupposition of women's equal rights is that democracy is a good thing to begin with, which Nietzsche completely disagreed with, and so do I. This idea that legitimacy comes from what the majority of people vote on. What the fuck is that? Where did you get that from? The best arguments from that are already there in Plato's Republic 2,400 years ago, right? The rule of the majority is the tyranny of the stupidest, most base, unimaginative people who are going to tyrannize over free spirits based on all their petty prejudices and retarded, regressive ideas, right? So, okay, that's a democracy. And then in that context, you want women to have equal rights to the rights that Nietzsche doesn't think men should have to begin with. That's an important context in terms of understanding things Nietzsche says about women. And the other is that he's just a fucking contrarian who way too often talked a lot of shit to just antagonize people in a catalytic way. So he says all this dumb shit about women, but then if you look at actually how he was as a person in his relationships with women in his life and with people in general, He was not so. Nietzsche would be appalled. He would not give a Nick Fuentes the time of day. He would think this is the most dysgenic, despicable, untermenschen garbage who should be eugenically eliminated before anybody else. Okay, that would have been Nietzsche's personal sentiment. As he was a yeah. Anyway, you have to have a sense of the man. That's important too.
No,
The
absolutely.
biography of philosophers is also something important.
Yeah. No, I'm not trying to necessarily pit you against Nietzsche, but I guess it helps my understanding as well, with these sort of things, because obviously something that Steph said last week is like everybody tries to appropriate Nietzsche to further their aim. So I've heard, there's my interpretation from reading it, and then there's like 12 different, interpretations. You have the really low IQ Jordan Petersons all the way up to like the really good interpretation. So I guess I'm just refining I'm polishing my own understanding for these things. But on that point, I'd like to kind of close things off with a little bit of maybe talking about some of the things we alluded to earlier with like the negative potential post-human futures. And then I'll have one last question after that. But, we talk about Faye, for example, and you had a podcast where you said you originally wanted to use the term Archeo Futurism, but then Faye had already used it. And, you felt that he incorrectly used the term because his, futurism is sort of neo-feudal, as you put it. And I'll admit, I haven't read Faye yet. I intend to, but just from the slight exposure I've had to Faye, I get the sense that maybe his ideal future was something approximating Dune, because Dune's this neo-feudal future where, and I think Dune's interesting. I think it's completely unrealistic, but I always it's interesting, the whole human evolution is actually hindered by technology is an interesting take, which obviously I don't agree with. But is that maybe somewhat of the future that he perceives? And if not, what is the future that he perceives?
That's a really good comparison, and I'm sorry I didn't come up with it myself. This actually didn't occur to me, but you definitely have something there. That the way in which AI and robotics are banned in Dune, that certain technologies are considered detrimental to a traditional conception of the meaning and purpose of human life, and so they're banned. But other technologies are used essentially to empower a neo-feudal, not a feudal, not neo. There's no neo anything. It's a freaking
Yeah,
feudal system.
very feudal. Yeah,
Dune is the classic, set of houses that are in competition with each other and a feudal hierarchy, and technology, advanced technology, is being used to spread this feudal system through the, galaxy. And yeah, I think that's very true to what Faye imagines. And there's also a racial element in Faye, where I think that, this is, of course, one of the distinctions between Faye and Alain de Benoit, where Alain de Benoit is more like Dugin. Dugin and Benoit are sort of more over here together in terms of, all people are different from each other. Let's be separate and different, not be subsumed under a false notion of equality, and let different ethnicities do their own thing. And there's no reason why we white people with our tech, they wouldn't say white, Dugin and Benoit, why we Europeans should impose our technological science on the rest of the world. No, if Africans want to live the way they were living 500 years ago and 1,000 years ago and 5,000 years ago, let them continue to live that way. Let's not mess their. Yeah, exactly. So you have Alain de Benoit and Dugin kind of in that area, and claiming to be anti-racist on that ground. And Faye is very decidedly, he's a white supremacist. Faye is we're going to create Euro-Siberia, and we're going to use it. We're going to use technologies that don't threaten our traditions in order to bolster and preserve our traditional European way of life, which, by the way, is superior to everybody else, right? And he wants to kind of hoard technology in order to preserve what he perceives as a superior, quasi-feudal European traditional society. So yeah, it's a hybridization of, it's a kind of superficial bolstering of feudal society with technology, where you would still have, because probably like Dune, he would ban robots or AI or whatever, still have serfs and shit. Maybe they use machines like in Star Wars, like, where Luke has like droids to help him with the farming, right? He has like, but still you need farmers out in the field and whatever. So it's that kind of thing. And I think that's just a really deracinated, superficial uh, misuse of the potential that the term archaeofuturism could have. Where to me, archaeofuturism, which again, like you said, I wanted to coin this term and I Googled it. This character came up, I've never heard of him before. And by the way, that's how I found Arctos. Is they published this. I was like, who is this guy and who is this publisher publishing them? And the rest is history. Anyway, so I wanted to use that term. What do I want to use it to mean? The fact that Zarathustra was already a futurist. The fact that in archaic Greece, not even classical Greece, in archaic Greece and archaic Iran, we already have the conception of the future. In Prometheus is a character of archaic Greece, not even the classical period yet. And so my idea with archaeofuturism was that the future is not a time to come. It's not an epoch in a succession of epochs. The future is a mindset. Being a futurist is to have a certain mentality, the kind of mentality that Zarathustra had 3,000 years ago, where he's talking about sepantominu, the progressive mentality or the spirit of progress at work on a cosmic scale, resisting angraminu, or the force of constriction and constraint and retardation. These become, the defining spirit of Ahura Mazda, defining quality of Ahura Mazda, and then Ahriman, right? Sepantominu is the quintessential characteristic of Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Wisdom, the Titan of Wisdom, and then Ahriman is the counter force, or Angraminu. And so this is what I wanted archaeofuturism to mean, is that there was always a battle between futurism and tradition. And interestingly, it's a thing that I found later on, René Guénon already says. And, Guénon has some very insightful remarks, despite my, being a, philosophical adversary of his. I think he's got one thing very right. And that's that there's a superficial materialist form of modernity, which makes for a really easy target. Okay? And that's the kind of shit being promoted through, Yuval Harari, and with Neuralink and all this superficial materialist transhuman, Ray Kurzweil, right? All that. That's a very easy target for traditionalists to aim at. Guénon said that is an early form of that's a nascent, undeveloped form of modernity, and that when modernity comes into full flower, the ultimate form of modernity is not a materialist anti-tradition. It is an occult counter-tradition. And that modernity's ultimate form would be totally occult, like it would involve all use of all kinds of paranormal powers and shit, but in a way that's radically pragmatic and irreverent and not under any divine authority. And, Guénon, of course, saw this as satanic, this coming of the Dajjal, of the Antichrist, right? And he said that modality of modernity in its fulfillment and completion is not a stage in history that we've contingently arrived at by happenstance. It's a form of human life that's always a possibility open to us and always has been. And insightfully or anamnetically, Guénon says that there was a future before. There was an earlier modernity. And we've gone through modernities before. And what he's talking about is Atlantis. He knows. Yeah, he knows these things. Okay. So modernity is the future is a state of mind. So archaeofuturism to me was a way of saying we've always been futurists. We were futurists in Atlantis. In Atlantis, we were fighting already for the future, right? There are ruins on Mars, in Cydonia, on Mars. There are pyramids. There's a pyramid 3 times the size of the Great Pyramid at Giza. There's all kinds of anomalous structures on the surface of Mars. More and more of them are being found. Recently, there was one shown on Joe Rogan, giant rectilineal form coming out of the sand. No question it was engineered. So there's blasted ruins on Mars. So there was a future on Mars before our history even began. So archaeofuturism to me means that the timeless battle for the future. That idea that you brought up early on, how speed is, more ontologically primary than time. Speed is ontologically prior to time, and that it's possible to outspeed time, right? And have a hyperdimensional relationship to historical epochs in chronological time. That's the battle for the future, which has always been. It's the metapolemos. The metapolemos is the battle for the future that's always been. The battle that Zarathustra was engaged in, the battle that Prometheus inaugurated.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating. And it's nice to hear you go into depth in that, because I think you were on, it was either with Steph or with Gnostic Informant that you talked about the archaeofuturist thing, but I don't think you went into as much detail. So that's really interesting. Do you think that it's still worth reading Faye, or I don't know, should I read someone else?
I'll tell you honestly, because of the audience that you have and the context in which you're working, it's probably a good idea. Simply because there'll be a lot of people in your audience that have at least superficially come across his work or whatever, and you want to be conversant in these ideas. So probably in your case, it's worth taking a look at. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone who's like pursuing a philosophical project or something. From a philosophical standpoint, it's there's no there. It's which is why, like, when I came on the scene through Arctos and so forth, and people say, "Oh, he's like the new Guillaume Faye or whatever." He's like, he's taking the place that Guillaume Faye, that Guillaume Faye had, because basically I came on the scene like a year or two before Faye died. So there's a whole archaeofuturist contingent within the right that started to try to say, "Oh, Jorjani is like the new Faye or whatever." Sorry, but Guillaume Faye is not even a rudimentary thinker. He's So look, it's important only because you have a certain audience, and there's a certain cultural critique that's going on here in your show and whatever. And for that purpose, it's worth taking a look at. But he's no deep thinker.
Well, maybe at least reading him will help me write better science fiction or something. It'll just give me some more material to ponder, even if it doesn't have much philosophical value.
Yeah, I would probably spend time reading the Dune series instead.
Oh, I have. Yeah, I read up to the 4th one. I couldn't get through. It was just so gross. Dune 4, where the worm guy. I hate it. I'd stop reading. And also, I heard that Frank Herbert started doing a shit ton of acid when he wrote the 4th one, and that's why the book's totally changed. I love the first 3. Could not get through the 4th. Haven't picked up since then. But I do love the Dune series. Absolutely. Even if
I've never written on drugs, so it's probably what anyone might think. It's probably not a great idea. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know how Philip K. Dick got away with producing as decent prose as he did, doing all of those amphetamines. But
right. Yeah. Well, now unless you're Jack Kerouac or Philip K. Dick, maybe I don't know. We'll see. We'll see.
Yeah,
the future's in flux, right? Maybe I need a little.
That's right.
Anyway, yeah, that was kind of where I wanted to trail off. But I just a few more questions before we wrap it up. Do you recommend reading Sloterdijk? Because from what I've no. Why not? Because I've been recommended him, and I thought you might know a bit about him.
I translated him for my German language requirement during my PhD. So I have read him to the level in the original German where I had to actually translate the book. I don't recommend it. There's nothing. First of all, the entire academic discourse of continental philosophy is lost in all kinds of completely abstruse and obtuse language where like they go through all kinds of gymnastics to say something that it would be so simple to just like come out and say straight, or with some kind of aesthetic consideration, right? I mean, it's not like they're being poetic for the sake of aesthetic effect. Their writing is not poetic, it's crap. And let me tell you, it's actually hazardous to your health. Reading enough contemporary continental philosophy will destroy your capacity to write well. And let me say this about my own work. Like, Prometheus and Atlas is a groundbreaking work in a lot of ways. It was, when it came out, it was hailed by a lot of people in the parapsychology community, for example, as the most significant work in parapsychology for decades. And, philosophically, it's definitely groundbreaking. But I have to say that looking back on it, I think the style is garbled. I don't like the way that book is written, Prometheus. There are parts in it that, you can see my literary voice developing, and it's unique and then becomes something that I go on to develop in my corpus. But honestly, a lot of the language of Prometheus and Atlas is weighed down by having read way too much gobbledygook from out of continental philosophy, contemporary European philosophy. It's horrendous. As much as the analytics, the Anglo-American analytics, have lost themselves in logic chopping and just completely abstruse, commentaries on linguistic syntax and such nonsense, the European continentals can't say a single fucking thing straight. Then when you finally boil down all the nonsense they're talking to like something tangible, some kind of proposition or some kind of relevant observation, it's incredibly simple what they're saying and timid and sheepish. It require 20, 30 pages like of gobbledygook. And where it really comes from? Psychosocial trauma. These Europeans, and particularly the Germans, like Sloterdijk, are so traumatized by the legacy of Heidegger and Nietzsche and that, and what happened to them through the Second World War, that they're afraid to take any position or make any kind of substantive argument, or God's forbid, like say something in a poetically compelling way, because next thing you know, arms might go up, so they have to be ugly and just. So, I don't recommend it. Remember we were talking about earlier, you surround yourself with enough ugliness and it will paralyze your will to life.
That's one of them.
State of contemporary continental philosophy. Sadly.
Well, I'm glad I asked because
you want a challenge? Read Heidegger.
Yeah,
read
he's hard.
And read Heidegger.
Yeah.
Even Husserl still writes like, he has a brain. Like Husserl, his writing is pretty clear. It's sophisticated, but it's clear. Once you get to Deleuze, Deleuze is at least saying something, unlike Baudrillard, But once you get to those people, like a generation of Baudrillard, Derrida, Deleuze, part of what I've been trying to do is revive philosophy on the other side of this. Like, this is a fucking nightmare. And it's a sign of a, disintegration. It's like, the decay of our civilization. It's like a rotting corpse.
We're in an intellectual Kali Yuga right now.
Yeah. It's like, they're writing, the style of the writing of contemporary continental philosophy, it has the aroma of a decaying corpse, really.
Yeah. And arguably the best books on philosophy aren't even written by philosophers anymore.
Point.
A lot of times.
Very unfortunately. Zizek is, he's all right. Zizek is, but is he going to provide solutions to the challenges posed by the technological singularity? Is he conversant with, the occulted psychic abilities of humanity that are going to be resurgent and recognized again on the other side of studying AI, studying consciousness through the development of AI? No. I mean, Zizek has nothing to say about any of these issues that are the most salient issues of our time. You don't have anything to say about the UFO phenomenon either.
Isn't he pretty reductionist? Right? I don't know much about him, but
I wouldn't accuse him of that.
yeah.
I wouldn't accuse him of that. Okay. And he reads people still like Schelling, who are definitely not reductionists, and he takes them seriously. He takes Bergson somewhat seriously. Look, but the thing with Zizek is like none of what he is saying, none of what he's on about is relevant to the existential challenges that we face in our time, whether it's singularity level technology or the reemergence of psychic abilities on a society-wide scale, or the UFO phenomenon. And what the fuck that means? What is this thing that we're about to be in open contact with? I mean, shouldn't the philosophers of our society be the ones grappling with these most challenging existential issues? Where are any of them? Where are any of them? I'm out here like, for fuck's sake, this is not an island that I should be on alone, right? So anyway, but that's how it is. Contemporary continental philosophy is trash.
Yeah.
It's Euro trash.
Well, after this, I need to get a list from you of what I should read, because I've read all of Nietzsche pretty much. Like, I think I've read everything from Nietzsche except for like the really small stuff, like the essays and whatnot. I've had a hard time reading Being and Time. Like, I go back to it every now and again. It's so hard. And I read a lot of other.
You know how you should approach Heidegger? Read Heidegger's lectures on the history of philosophy first. Heidegger, there's transcriptions of all these lectures that he gave about Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Leibniz even, and his lectures on Nietzsche, which are amazing. Heidegger is a great historian of philosophy. And once you become familiar with his ideas through his lectures, which he had to make, intelligible to students of all levels, then you can reapproach his magnum opus and, some of his essays that are more complex.
Sounds good. I'll do that. Well, yeah, I mean, I had a great time having you on, great conversation. To close it off, I just wanted to read one last quote from the Black Book. This was in the end of Philosophy of the Future, which I think people will appreciate. We're talking about unfettering yourself, allowing yourself to face truth, and with courage and without fear. So I'm going to read this quote at the end of Philosophy in the Future, and you're talking about Lucifer. How do you say it? Santanian? Satana, yeah. And you're talking about being mind fucked by wisdom, and I thought that I liked that. Oh wait, no, this wasn't from the Black Book. This was just the end of the of Philosophy of the Future. But
but you're right though. No, it follows from a long quotation from my Black Notebook.
Okay, good.
Which then in Metapolemos, I show you the larger context for that.
Gotcha. All right, I got it right then. But I really like this quote. So you're talking about this, and you said, "She came all right. It resulted in decades of heartbreak, betrayal, humiliation, disgrace, disillusionment, and destitution, which culminated in a corpus of a dozen devastating volumes of philosophy, from Prometheus and Atlas to this book. She fucked me and left me broken to the future. She desecrated the idols of the last men and consecrated the philosophy of the future. Terror, territory, terrorism, metaphysical arson, ontological shock, catastrophic disclosure. This mistress of the Wolfen can look quite like the Scarlet Harlot, but the truth is that she's more akin to an octopus, and her every tentacle is thinking hard. Let her wrap herself around you like I have. Let her fuck your head and rape your minds. Aye, until you want more. Let her show you what she's shown me. Come with Lucifera to the end of the world. Her rules are loose. Thus spoke Zarathustra." Anyway, I like that quote, and I thought I had to share it to the Legionaries. But thanks for coming on. Thank you, Legionaries, for watching. This will probably be at least 2 parts, since it was a long conversation. But as always, this is the Warrior Philosopher, building the foundations of the Warrior Philosophy. And we'll see you, Legionaries, next time.